At 10 o'clock on the night of July 15th, 1969, a man walked into a windowless room on the third floor of Building 30 in Houston, Texas, and sat down in front of a great console that held the lives of three men he had never met. He had 11 hours until the largest machine ever built by human hands would leave the ground in Florida, 900 miles to the east, and the instant it cleared the tower, this room, his room, would own it. Not the Cape, not Florida, this room. A windowless box of green screens in the Texas dark. His name is not the point, and that is exactly the point. What matters is the console, the cigarette already burning in the ashtray, the cold coffee, and the 1,500 separate readings he was about to watch for the rest of the night. 1,500. Dials, gauges, columns of green digits flickering on a black screen, each one a number that meant a fuel line, a valve, a battery, a heartbeat. If any one of them went wrong in the wrong second, 3 astronauts strapped to 6 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen would either never leave the pad or never come home. He had this one night to make sure none of them would. The flight controller I am putting in that chair is composite, drawn across several of the real men who sat those consoles in the summer of '69, reconstructed from the NASA Johnson Space Center oral histories, from Gene Kranz's own account of those rooms, from the recollections gathered by Andrew Chaikin. The room is real, the machines are real, the night is real, hour by hour. I have made him one man because the truth is harder to picture. He was 200 men, and 200 men is the real answer to the question almost nobody asks. Who actually flew Apollo 11? You think you know this story. You have seen the photograph. The white plume, the rocket rising on a pillar of fire, the date burned into every textbook. You know Armstrong. You may know Aldrin and Collins. But the 3 men in the capsule were not flying that spacecraft. Not really. From the moment the Saturn V cleared the launch tower on the morning of the 16th, the mission did not belong to Florida, and it did not, in any meaningful way, belong to the men on top of the rocket. It belonged to a room full of men in white short-sleeved shirts and skinny ties in Houston, most of them in their 20s, the kind of room where a man of 30 was one of the old ones. The men who put America on the moon were younger than most of the people watching this. And tonight, the night before, that room was awake. The official name of the place was the Mission Operations Control Room, MOCR, on the 3rd floor of Building 30 at the Manned Spacecraft Center, in the flat scrubland southeast of Houston, near a brand new town called Clear Lake City, a town that had barely existed a few years before NASA dropped a space program onto the Texas coastal plain. The men who worked there called it simply the Control Room, or Mission Control, or sometimes just the room. 4 tiers of consoles facing a wall of enormous screens. Gray steel, pneumatic tubes that hissed paper messages from desk to desk. Beneath the floor and down the hall, the IBM machines, 2 of them, a primary and a backup, each the size of a row of refrigerators, that took the river of radio data pouring down from the spacecraft and turned it into the green numbers on his screen. A modern phone in your pocket is more powerful than every computer in that building combined, by a margin so large it stops being a comparison and becomes a joke. The guidance computer that would actually fly the spacecraft to the moon held about 2,000 words of memory and ran a few tens of thousands of instructions a second. A pocket calculator from a drugstore would outrun it. And these men were going to thread that computer and that rocket through 250,000 miles of vacuum to a moving target and back, with slide rules in their breast pockets and ashtrays at their elbows. He lit another cigarette off the first. There is a thing people get wrong about this room, and it is the thing the movies always sand down smooth. They show you the cheering, the backslapping, the moment of triumph with the flags and the cigars. That moment was real, but it was a few minutes out of years, and it was bought with nights exactly like this one, where nothing happened, where the work was the opposite of glory. The work was checking. The work was a man with a checklist and a console and a stopwatch, going down a list of numbers, one at a time, in a cold room, in the dark, hour after hour, the night before, while the rest of the country slept and dreamed about astronauts. Down the hall behind his console sat a back room of perhaps a dozen specialists. Men who knew his one system the way a surgeon knows one organ. Men whose names would never be spoken on any broadcast. Who fed him answers through a headset when a number drifted. That was the secret architecture of the thing. Every console in the front room was the visible tip of a buried pyramid of people. And every one of those people tonight was running the same numbers of final time. The flight director for the launch shift was a man named Cliff Charlesworth, who ran what they called the Green Team, and who carried that night the one authority that mattered. He, and only he, could say the words that stopped a launch. Everyone in the room could raise a hand. Only the flight director could lower the boom. And Charlesworth's job tonight, and the job of every man under him, was to arrive at the morning having earned the right to say a single word when the count reached 0. The word was go. But to understand why this room was awake at 3 in the morning over a launch that was happening in another state, you have to understand what they were really afraid of. And it was not failure. It was something far more specific and far worse, and it had a date attached to it. It was a Friday in January, 2.5 years earlier, and it had happened in a sealed capsule on a pad that was not even supposed to be dangerous. January 27th, 1967. A routine ground test. 3 astronauts, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, sealed inside an Apollo capsule on the pad, the hatch bolted, the cabin filled with pure oxygen at higher than sea level pressure. A spark, somewhere in the wiring nobody ever pinned down for certain. In a pure oxygen atmosphere, a spark is not a spark. It is a blowtorch. The fire took all 3 in seconds. They could not get the hatch open. It opened inward, and the pressure inside held it shut like a vault. The men in the control room did not start that fire and could not have stopped it. But they had watched it happen on their loops, helpless, listening. And 3 days later, on the 30th of January, the flight director, Gene Kranz, stood in front of his people and gave a short, brutal talk that every controller in that building could recite by heart 2.5 years later. He told them spaceflight would never tolerate carelessness or neglect. He told them that from that day on, the words on every blackboard would be tough and competent. Tough meaning forever accountable for what you do and what you fail to do. Competent meaning you never stop learning. Write it on your blackboards, he said, and never erase it. That was the religion of this room. That was why a man sat at a console at midnight, checking numbers that 3 other men had already checked. Because in this room, the opposite of competent was not embarrassment. The opposite of competent was a sealed capsule and a fire nobody could reach. So he worked, down the checklist 1 line at a time. The work of a flight controller was not the work the public imagined. It was not staring heroically at a screen. It was a slow, exacting conversation, in numbers, between a man on the ground and a machine that was not yet flying. Telemetry was the word for it. The spacecraft and the rocket, even sitting fueled on the pad in Florida, were whispering a continuous stream of data back through the radio links, down to the antennas, into the IBM machines beneath the floor, and up onto a screen as those green digits. Pressures, temperatures, voltages, the state of every valve. He was not reading a story. He was reading a pulse. And his job was to know, in his marrow, what every number should be, so that the instant one of them was wrong, he would feel it the way you feel a missed step on a staircase in the dark. There is a phrase those men used about each other, the highest praise one of them could give another. They called a man a steely-eyed missile man. It meant he had once, under pressure, seen the wrong number before anyone told him it was wrong, and acted, and been right. You did not give yourself that name. It was given, and every man in the room that night wanted it and feared the moment that would earn it. Around him, the room breathed in its strange rhythm. The pneumatic tubes hissed and thumped, carrying scribbled notes between desks. Somewhere, a teletype chattered. A man 2 consoles over read out a string of figures in the flat, clipped cadence they all fell into on the loops. A voice drained of all feeling on purpose, because feeling was noise and the channel was for signal. Headsets, cigarette smoke layering the air under the fluorescent lights until the far wall went soft. Coffee that had been hot at 9 and was vinegar by 1. And the screens at the front, the big ones, holding the great map of where the spacecraft would go, a thin line arcing off the edge of the world. He thought, the way men in that room admitted thinking, only decades later to an oral historian with a tape recorder running, about how small the margins were. Not dramatically small, arithmetically small. The guidance computer that would steer the lunar module to the surface had less working memory than the sentence, "I am saying now," would fill. The men had checked its program by hand, by eye, line by line, because there was no other way to check it. When something went wrong in flight, and something always went wrong, there would be no time to think it through from first principles. There would be time only to recognize it, which meant the thinking had to be done now, tonight, in advance. Every failure they could imagine, rehearsed until the response was reflex. That was the real labor of the night before. Not the launch. The launch was the easy part in a sense. A few minutes of violence, the rocket performed on schedule. The hard part was the imagining. Sitting in a quiet room, fully fed, perfectly safe, and forcing your mind to walk through every way 3 men could die 900 miles away and 250,000 miles beyond that, and deciding in advance what you would do about each one. A simulation supervisor in the building had spent the past months doing nothing but inventing disasters to throw at these men, harder and crueler each time, until the men hated him and trusted him in equal measure. The hatred was the point. By the real morning, no failure the universe could offer would be stranger than what the sim team had already done to them on a Tuesday afternoon. He checked the cryogenic tank pressures. He checked them again. He noted the time on a pad and pencil. Outside the windowless walls, the Texas night sat heavy and warm over the flat country around Clear Lake, a town that had not existed in any real sense a decade before, conjured out of cattle pasture, because a space program needed somewhere to put 200 young engineers and their new wives and their first mortgages. Most of them were asleep out there now. He was not. The numbers held steady. Good. Steady was the most beautiful word in his language. Steady meant nothing was becoming a story, but the count was moving. Down in Florida, the great machine was being topped off with its propellants, breathing white vapor into the dark, and the clock that governed all of them, the clock that did not care whether anyone was tired, was walking toward the morning. And at the consoles, as the hours thinned toward dawn, the mood in the room began, very slightly, to change. Because the part of the night that was only checking was ending, and the part that could not be taken back was about to begin. Somewhere past 4 in the morning, the coffee stopped working, and the room went very quiet and very awake at the same time. The particular alertness of people who have been up all night and have arrived, finally, at the thing they stayed up for. In Florida, the astronauts were being woken, were eating the traditional steak and eggs, were being sealed into their suits, were riding the elevator up the side of a building-tall rocket in the dark. None of that was his to watch. His was the river of numbers, and the river was rising. This is the moment to say plainly what was actually about to be set in motion, because the rocket on that pad was not a large airplane. It was the most powerful machine human beings had ever built, and by some measures, have ever built since. The Saturn V stood 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty with her torch raised. Fully fueled, it weighed 6 million pounds, the better part of it kerosene and liquid oxygen, waiting to be married in a controlled explosion. At its base, 5 engines, called the F1, each one taller than a man is, and producing 1.5 million pounds of thrust. 5 of them. 7.5 million pounds of thrust, lifting off a pad a quarter mile from the nearest human being, because no one could survive being closer. When those 5 engines lit, they would burn 15 tons of propellant every second. The shockwave would cross the marshes and roll over the spectators 3 miles away and hit them in the chest like a fist. Reporters who had covered the earlier launches wrote that you did not hear a Saturn V so much as you were assaulted by it, that the sound came up through the ground and through the folding chairs and through the bones of your legs. At the press sites 3 miles off, the plate glass windows of the broadcast booths shook in their frames, and the men behind them reached out instinctively to hold the glass. But all of that was Florida's. In the cold room in Texas, the man at the console heard none of it. He heard the loops. He heard the flat voices counting. And as the count came down inside the final minutes, the authority over the mission was riding toward him along the wires, invisible, about to land in his lap. Here's the thing the photographs cannot show you, the inversion that is the whole secret of this story. The launch happened in Florida. Control did not. The arrangement, set years before, was deliberate and strange. The rocket would rise from the Cape, but the instant it cleared the launch tower, the entire mission would hand over, in a single planned heartbeat, to the room in Houston. The men who lit the rocket would, seconds later, be spectators. The men who would actually fly it, all the way to the moon and back, were sitting in the dark in Texas, 900 miles from a single drop of that fuel. So the count ran out. In Florida, ignition. The 5 engines caught, building thrust for long seconds, while the hold-down arms still gripped the rocket to the Earth, the computers confirming all 5 were running true before anything was released. Because a Saturn V that lifted on 4 engines was a bomb walking sideways into its own gantry. All 5 true. Release. 363 feet of machine unstuck itself from the planet, agonizingly slow at first, slower than seemed possible for something so violent, clawing upward inch by inch on a column of fire as long as the rocket itself. And it cleared the tower. In that instant, in Houston, the room took the ship. There was no ceremony to it. A word on the loop, a handoff. The flight director's team in Texas now owned Apollo 11, and the man at the console felt the change the way you feel a current take a boat. A sudden, subtle weight. The numbers on his screen that had been a rehearsal 1 second and were live history the next. The vehicle was climbing. The numbers were good. He was reading the pulse of a thing that was now genuinely leaving the world, and he was one of the hands that held it. And his entire body had narrowed to the single discipline of watching one set of green digits and being ready, ready, ready for the one that might go wrong. None did. Not in those first minutes. The great machine rolled onto its heading, shed its first stage in a flash of separation, far downrange over the Atlantic, lit its second stage, kept climbing. The voices on the loop stayed flat. Flat was good. Flat was the sound of 200 men, each watching their 1,500 numbers stay where the numbers were supposed to be. Somewhere in there, the spacecraft passed out of the dangerous low minutes and into orbit, and a thing that had been theoretical for a decade and lethal for 3 minutes became, simply, a fact. 3 men were in space, on their way, and the room in Houston had flown them off the planet without a single soul in that room ever leaving Texas. He did not cheer. Not yet, and not much even later. The job was not the launch. The job was the next 8 days, the burn that would fling them toward the moon, the landing nobody in that room would let themselves picture too clearly, because the landing was the part that truly frightened them, the part where the underpowered computer and the moving target and the unforgiving fuel margins all came due at once. That was 4 days away. He could not think about it yet. He could only do what the room had taught him. Think about the number in front of him, and the next number, and the next. And as the spacecraft settled into its orbit and the immediate danger passed, in the gray light now coming up over the flat Texas country, outside the walls he could not see through, the man at the console let himself feel, for the first time in 11 hours, how tired he was. He had been awake all night so that 3 strangers could go to the moon. They did not know his name. They never would. And that, he understood, was not the tragedy of the thing. That was the whole point of it. He went home that morning to a small new house in a town built on cattle pasture, and he slept through the heat of the day while the rest of the country talked of nothing but the 3 men riding away from the Earth. Then he came back, because the night before the launch was only the first night. There were 7 more. What he could not let himself picture on launch morning came due on the 20th of July, the landing. A different flight director's shift held the consoles that afternoon, Gene Kranz and the White Team. And it is from that afternoon that the one story everybody half remembers comes. The only moment when the buried machinery of this room broke the surface and the public glimpsed what it was actually made of. As the lunar module dropped toward the surface, an alarm none of the men in the capsule could interpret began flashing on the guidance computer. A number, 1202. The two astronauts did not know what it meant. Neither, for a heartbeat, did most of the room. But a guidance officer on the console, a man of 26 named Steve Bales, had been put through this exact failure in a simulation only weeks before. And a specialist named Jack Garman, sitting in one of those buried back rooms with a handwritten list of every alarm code, had on that list, in his own hand, the meaning of 1202. The computer was overloaded, but still doing the one job that mattered. It was safe to go. Bales had seconds. He said, "Go!" And because a 26-year-old in Texas had been tortured by a simulation supervisor until the right answer was reflex, two men landed on the moon instead of aborting 400 feet above it. That is, the night before launch, paying off 4 days later. That is the whole religion of the room, compressed into one word, spoken in time. This is the part of the story I most want you to carry. So before I finish it, I will ask you the one thing I ask. If you are still here, if this room has gotten into you the way it got into me, take a second to subscribe to the channel. I rebuild these days one at a time. The days the textbooks shrink down to a sentence and a photograph. And subscribing is how I know to keep walking through them with you. Now, what remains of that night? The room itself remains. The Mission Operations Control Room in Building 30 has been restored to the way it looked in the summer of '69, down to the coffee cups and the ashtrays and the glass on the consoles. And you can stand in the visitors gallery in Houston and look down on the empty chairs. It is smaller than you expect. That is the first thing everyone says. The room that flew men to the moon is smaller than a school gymnasium, and the consoles look, to a modern eye, like the dashboard of a machine that no longer exists. The men remain, for now, fewer each year. Many of them sat decades later in front of the cameras of the NASA Johnson Space Center Oral History Project and tried to explain what it had been like. And the striking thing, listening to them, is how rarely they talk about glory and how often they talk about the checking, the nights, the numbers, the simulation that broke them so the real thing could not. Gene Kranz wrote it down in his own memoir, and Andrew Chaikin gathered their voices into the fullest account we have of how the thing was actually flown. Read them, and the photograph changes. The plume of fire stops being the story moves into the dark room, 900 miles away, full of young men who would never be famous. Because here's the answer to the question I asked you at the beginning, the question almost nobody asks. Who flew Apollo 11? Not 3 men. 3 men wrote it. It was flown by a room, by the simulation supervisor who invented the disasters, by Garman with his handwritten list of nightmares, by Bales, 26, who said one word in time, by a flight director who made them write tough and competent on a blackboard and never erase it, and by a composite man at a console at midnight, checking cryogenic tank pressures for the second time the night before, whose name you will never know, because he was 200 men, and not one of them did it to be known. The next time you see that photograph, the white rocket on its pillar of fire, look just to the left of it, at the empty edge of the frame where the camera did not point. 250 miles that way, in a windowless room in the Texas dark, that is where the moon landing actually happened. It happened the night before, in pencil, on a checklist, in a room that smelled of cigarettes and cold coffee, where the most beautiful word in the language was steady, and where a tired young man went home at dawn, having done the most important work of the 20th century, and told almost no one.